December 14th, 1943. A conference room at Columbia University, Manhattan. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air as military officers spread diagrams across a mahogany table. Each diagram showed the silhouette of a B-17 flying fortress, covered with hundreds of red dots. Every dot marked where a bullet or piece of shrapnel had struck bombers returning from missions over Germany. The patterns were unmistakable. The fuselage bristled with damage. The wings showed concentrated hits. The tail surfaces were peppered with holes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. An Army Air Forces colonel tapped his finger on the fuselage section. Gentlemen, the data is clear. We need to add armor plating here, here, and here. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Engineers had spent months compiling this data. They had examined hundreds of damaged bombers. They had measured every hole, recorded every impact, created statistical summaries that filled thick binders. The conclusion seemed obvious to everyone in the room, everyone, except the quiet man sitting at the far end of the table. Abraham Wald said nothing at first. He simply studied the diagrams with dark, intense eyes that had learned to see what others missed. At 41 years old, this Austrian refugee had already survived one catastrophe by noticing details others overlooked. Now, as a mathematician working for the Statistical Research Group, he was about to save thousands of American airmen by asking a question so simple, so obvious, that no one else had thought to ask it. "Where," Wald said quietly in his accented English, "are the planes that did not return?" The room fell silent. The colonel looked confused. "I'm sorry, Professor Wald. I don't understand the question. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." Wald gestured at the diagrams. "These show only aircraft that survived combat and flew home to England. What about the aircraft that were shot down? Where were they hit?" The question hung in the air like the cigarette smoke. It was so simple, so fundamental. And yet, in months of analysis, with dozens of engineers and statisticians examining the data, no one had asked it. They had studied the survivors and drawn conclusions about vulnerability. Wald was suggesting they study the dead. But the dead bombers lay scattered across occupied Europe. Their crews were gone, killed, or captured. Their damage patterns could never be documented. The data simply did not exist. Or did it? Wald would spend the next several months proving that you could analyze data that did not exist, that you could draw conclusions from absence, that sometimes the most important evidence is what you cannot see. His work would become one of the most famous examples of statistical reasoning in history. It would save thousands of lives during World War II. It would create a principle that would reshape how people think about evidence and success across every field, from medicine to business to technology. And it would all begin with recognizing that the most dangerous trap in analysis is studying only the survivors. The winter of 1943 was killing American bomber crews faster than training schools could replace them. Every morning across England, young men climbed into their B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, knowing the mathematics of their survival. The numbers were brutal and inescapable. Most bomber crews had a statistical life expectancy of just 11 missions. They were required to fly 25 missions before they could go home. Do the arithmetic. 1 in 4 crews would survive their tour, 3 in 4 would not. Staff Sergeant Michael DeLuca, a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, kept a notebook that survived the war. His entry from December 1943 captured the mood with devastating clarity. New crew moved into Johnson's barracks today. Fresh faces, clean uniforms, still have that look like they think they're going to make it. We all had that look once. Johnson and his crew went down over Schweinfurt 2 weeks ago. Before that, it was Kowalski's crew. Before that, Martinez. I've been here 4 months, and I'm one of the old hands now. I've flown 8 missions. Statistically, I'm living on borrowed time. De Luca would complete 19 missions before his B-17 was shot down over Bremen in February 1944. He survived as a prisoner of war, one of only 3 members of his 10-man crew to live through the war. The losses were staggering beyond comprehension. In October 1943 alone, during what became known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers in just 7 days. 7 days, October 8th through October 14th, Bremen, Anklam, Marienburg, Münster, and finally on October 14th, the second raid on Schweinfurt, Black Thursday. On that single day, 60 B-17 seconds were shot down in combat. 17 more were damaged so badly they never flew again. 600 men lost in one day, one mission. For the week as a whole, 148 bombers destroyed. That was nearly 13% of the attacking force. 1,500 airmen gone, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. 1,500 families who would receive the dreaded telegram. We regret to inform you, 1,500 empty chairs at dinner tables back home. 1,500 young men who would never see their 25th birthday. And this was just 1 week. The military brass knew they needed a solution urgently. Bombers were being shot to pieces faster than new ones could be built. The factories back home worked at maximum capacity. New B-17 seconds rolled off assembly lines every hour, at plants in Seattle, Long Beach, and Tulsa. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed poured everything they had into production, but they could not replace losses fast enough. Something had to change. The solution seemed obvious. Add armor to protect the aircraft and their crews. But armor meant weight. Every pound mattered on a bomber. These aircraft were already pushing the limits of what 1940s technology could achieve. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines on a B-17 each produced 1,200 horsepower. Impressive for the era, but there were hard limits. Every pound of armor meant 1 less pound of bombs to drop on the target, or 1 less pound of fuel to get home, or 1 less pound of ammunition for the defensive guns. The engineers ran calculations constantly. If you added too much weight, the bomber could not reach its operational altitude of 25,000 feet. It would be a sitting duck for fighters. If you added too much weight, it could not carry enough fuel to reach targets deep in Germany and return. Add too much armor in the wrong places, and the plane might not even be able to take off with a full bomb load. But too little armor meant the current nightmare would continue. More young men dying every day, more bombers spiraling down in flames, more formations torn apart by German defenses that were getting better, not worse, not declining. The balance was critical. There was a sweet spot somewhere. An optimal amount and placement of armor that would save lives without crippling the bomber's ability to do its job. Someone had to figure out where to put the limited armor they could carry. It seemed like a straightforward problem. Study where the planes are getting hit. Add armor to those areas. Protect the vulnerable spots. The military had the best engineers in the country working on this. They had combat veterans who had flown the missions. They had designers who knew every rivet and bolt in these aircraft. They began their analysis methodically. Technical crews met each bomber as it landed from missions over Europe. Before crews could even debrief, before they could stumble to the mess hall for hot coffee and try to stop their hands from shaking, inspectors swarmed over their aircraft with clipboards and cameras. They documented every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every torn section of aluminum skin, every damaged system. They measured the holes. They recorded locations precisely using a grid system that divided each aircraft into dozens of zones. They photographed damage from multiple angles. They noted what had been hit: fuel lines, control cables, hydraulic systems, oxygen bottles. They recorded whether the damage had affected aircraft performance. Back at analysis centers in England and at Wright Field in Ohio, they compiled this data into detailed statistical summaries. After examining hundreds of aircraft across multiple bomb groups, clear patterns emerged. The data was remarkably consistent across different units, different targets, different types of missions. The fuselage showed heavy damage, holes everywhere, some small from machine gun fire, some large from 20mm and 30mm cannon shells. The cylindrical body of the bomber seemed to attract fire like a magnet. The wings showed concentrated damage, particularly the sections near the fuselage where they attached to the body. The control surfaces, the ailerons that controlled roll and the elevators that controlled pitch, were often peppered with holes. The tail sections showed heavy damage. Both the vertical stabilizer and the horizontal stabilizers had taken beating after beating. Gunners reported that German fighters often attacked from the rear, where the tail gunner sat alone in the most dangerous position on the aircraft. But the engines showed relatively little damage. Oh, there were some hits, but far fewer than the fuselage or wings. The 4 radial engines, each with 18 cylinders, arranged in a double row, seemed almost charmed. The data was clear on this point. The cockpit showed surprisingly little damage, some hits, but nothing like what the fuselage sustained. For such an obvious target, sitting right at the front of the aircraft where head-on attacks concentrated, the cockpit seemed almost protected. The fuel systems showed less damage than expected. The fuel tanks, which held hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, showed fewer hits than the surrounding structure. The engineers created comprehensive reports. Bar charts showed the percentage of returning aircraft with damage to each area. The fuselage, wings and tail topped every chart. The engines, cockpit, and fuel systems sat at the bottom. Tables listed total number of hits by zone across hundreds of aircraft. Maps showed damage density with color coding: red for heavy damage, yellow for moderate, green for light. The conclusion seemed inescapable, completely, utterly obvious to anyone looking at the data. Add armor to the parts taking the most hits. Reinforce the fuselage where the majority of damage occurred. Strengthen the wings that were getting torn up by fighters and flak. Protect the tail section that showed such consistent damage. These were the vulnerable areas. The data showed it clearly. Any engineer, any statistician, any military officer looking at these numbers would reach the same conclusion. The proposal went up the chain of command with strong recommendations. Add armor plating to the fuselage, strengthen wing spars, protect tail control surfaces. The weight calculations showed it was feasible. The armor would add approximately 800 pounds per aircraft. That would reduce bomb load by about 4% and fuel capacity by about 3%. But combat effectiveness would increase dramatically by protecting the areas that sustained the most damage. Production schedules were drawn up. Thousands of armor kits could be manufactured and installed within months. Training manuals were drafted to show ground crews how to install the reinforcements. The solution was ready for implementation. But first, as standard procedure, the proposal needed review by the Statistical Research Group. At Columbia University in Manhattan, just blocks from where the city's energy hummed with wartime urgency, a secret group of mathematicians and statisticians fought the war with equations instead of bullets. They called it the Statistical Research Group, the SRG, and these were not ordinary academics. This was arguably the most brilliant collection of mathematical minds ever assembled in one place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 18 researchers, each a specialist in their field. Future Nobel Prize winners worked side by side with the founders of modern statistics, names that would become legendary. Milton Friedman, who joined as associate director in 1943 and would later revolutionize economic theory and win the Nobel Prize in economics. Harold Hotelling, one of the 3 charter members who helped establish the group, already a legend in mathematical statistics. Alan Wallace, who directed daily research operations and kept the work focused on practical military problems. Leonard Savage, who would become one of the 20th century's most influential statisticians. Frederick Mosteller, who would pioneer modern statistical methods in medicine and social science. And working alongside these luminaries was a quiet refugee from Austria who had escaped the Nazis by the narrowest of margins. A man who thought differently, who saw patterns others missed, who asked questions others never thought to ask. Abraham Wald. The SRG was part of the Applied Mathematics panel, supported by the National Defense Research Committee. America was throwing everything it had at winning this war, including its intellectual firepower. The atmosphere was unlike anything in peacetime academia. There was urgency. Every problem they solved could save lives. Every delay could mean more deaths. Brilliant minds challenged each other daily across tables covered with data. Chalkboards filled with equations that looked like abstract art to outsiders, but were tools of war to these men. Arguments erupted over statistical methods, not with personal animosity, but with the passion of people who knew the stakes. Coffee flowed endlessly. Researchers worked late into the night, sometimes sleeping in their offices. Papers were stamped secret before being locked in safes. Visitors needed security clearance. The work could not leave the building. The SRG worked on hundreds of problems across all branches of military operations. Optimal pursuit curves for torpedoes, quality control for rocket fuel, sequential testing for ammunition. Fragmentation patterns for bombs. Optimal search patterns for anti-submarine warfare. The work was diverse, technical, and critically important. Each problem could mean the difference between mission success and failure, between lives saved and lives lost. And in December 1943, one of the most urgent problems landed on Abraham Wald's desk, the bomber armor problem. Abraham Wald had come to this moment by a path that twisted through tragedy and narrow escape. Born on October 31st, 1902 in Cluj, Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, he grew up in a world of multiple cultures and languages. The city, now called Cluj-Napoca and part of Romania, was a melting pot where Hungarians, Romanians, Germans, and Jews lived together in uneasy proximity. But Wald's family was defined by something more important than language or culture. They were deeply religious Orthodox Jews who followed the commandments strictly and lived by principles that set them apart from mainstream society. One of those commandments was keeping the Sabbath. From Friday evening, when the first stars appeared, until Saturday evening, when 3 stars could be seen, no work was permitted, no writing, no travelling, no cooking. And in the Orthodox interpretation that the Wald family followed, this included attending school. The Hungarian school system had no flexibility on this point. Classes were held 6 days a week, including Saturdays. There was no exception for religious observance, no accommodation for Jewish students who wanted to honour the Sabbath. The government saw no reason to adjust for religious minorities, so Wald's parents faced an impossible choice: violate their religious principles and send their son to school on Saturday, compromising the beliefs that defined their family, or keep him home and educate him themselves, knowing that homeschooling was risky and uncertain. They chose their faith. Abraham Wald was homeschooled by his parents and older siblings from early childhood all the way until he was ready for university. This could have been a disaster. Homeschooling in the early 1900s, without modern resources or curricula or support networks, was a tremendous gamble. Many homeschooled children fell far behind their peers. Some never caught up. But Wald's parents were not ordinary people, and they did not give their son an ordinary education. His father and older siblings gave him a rigorous, demanding education that would have challenged students in the best schools. Mathematics, where young Abraham showed immediate talent and fascination. Sciences, taught with whatever books and equipment they could obtain. Languages, essential in their multilingual city. Philosophy and logic, training his mind to think clearly and argue precisely. Religious studies, maintaining their traditions. The education was intense, focused, and tailored to one brilliant student who absorbed everything they taught him. By the time he was ready for university, Wald had not just kept pace with formally schooled students. He had surpassed them. He had mastered material that most students struggled with. More importantly, he had learned to learn independently, to solve problems without a teacher guiding every step, to think for himself. These skills, learned in isolation, would prove more valuable than any conventional schooling could have provided. The ability to approach problems from unexpected angles, to question assumptions, to see what others missed. These were not skills you learned by following a standard curriculum. These were skills you developed by being forced to figure things out on your own. In 1923, at age 20, Wald enrolled at King Ferdinand I University in Cluj to study mathematics. The university recognized his preparation immediately. He excelled in every course. Professors who initially worried about the homeschooled student quickly realized they had someone exceptional. He graduated in 1928 with distinction. Then he made the decision that would shape his career. He moved to Vienna, the intellectual capital of Central Europe, to pursue his doctorate. He studied at the University of Vienna under the supervision of Carl Menger, himself a legendary mathematician who was pioneering new fields in geometry and economics. Wald earned his doctorate in 1931 with a dissertation on geometry that showed remarkable originality. He was 28 years old. He was brilliant, creative, capable of seeing connections others missed. Any university in Europe would have been fortunate to have him on their faculty. He should have had offers from multiple institutions competing for his talents. But this was Vienna in the 1930s. This was Europe sliding toward catastrophe. Anti-Semitism was rising across the continent like a dark tide. Jewish scholars, no matter how talented or accomplished, faced systematic barriers to academic positions. Universities had quotas limiting Jewish faculty. Departments openly refused to hire Jews. The old academic establishment saw Jews as outsiders, as threats, as unworthy regardless of their abilities. Abraham Wald, despite his doctorate, despite his brilliance, despite his promise, could not get a university appointment. He applied. He was rejected. He applied again, rejected again, not because his work was inadequate, because he was Jewish. So instead of teaching and researching at a university, he worked as a mathematics tutor to Karl Schlesinger, a wealthy banker. It was steady work. It paid reasonably well. But it was a waste of extraordinary talent. A man capable of transforming mathematics reduced to teaching arithmetic to a banker's children. Later, Oskar Morgenstern, director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, recognized Wald's abilities and created an economics position for him. This was not charity. Morgenstern knew talent when he saw it. Wald began applying his mathematical skills to economic problems, bringing the same rigor and creativity to this new field that he had brought to geometry. He was making contributions, publishing papers, building a reputation among economists, but he was still shut out of academia proper, still unable to get the university position his abilities deserved. Then came March 1938, the Anschluss, the annexation, the catastrophe that Austrian Jews had feared but hoped might never come. Nazi Germany, emboldened by years of conquest and expansion, turned its attention to Austria. German troops crossed the border on the morning of March 12th. They met no resistance. Many Austrians welcomed them with cheers and Nazi salutes. The formal annexation law was signed March 13th. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. It became part of the German Reich. Overnight, Abraham Wald went from merely facing discrimination to facing extermination. For Austria's Jews, this was not a political change. This was existential threat. The Nazis immediately began implementing their racial laws with enthusiastic support from many Austrians. Jewish professionals were fired from their jobs within days. Jewish businesses were confiscated or destroyed. Jewish people were beaten in the streets by mobs, while police stood by watching or participating. Synagogues were vandalized. The persecution that had taken years to implement in Germany happened in Austria in weeks. Abraham Wald saw what was coming. He understood that this was not temporary, that this would get worse, not better, that staying meant death or imprisonment at best. That summer of 1938, just months after the Anschluss, he fled Austria for America. He left behind almost everything: his home, his work, his professional network, Most devastating of all, he left behind his parents, his siblings, most of his extended family. They could not all get visas. They could not all escape. Someone had to stay behind. He promised to send for them when he could. He promised to get them out. He never saw most of them again. All but one of the 9 family members who remained in Austria would die in Auschwitz, his parents, his siblings. People he loved, people who had educated him and shaped him and believed in him, gone into the machinery of genocide. And Abraham Wald, safe in America, would carry that survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. The knowledge that he had survived through luck and timing while those he loved had not. The understanding that his brilliant mind had earned him escape while others equally deserving had been murdered. This knowledge would colour everything he did, every problem he solved, every life he saved through his work. It could never balance the scales, could never bring back the dead, but perhaps it could mean something. Perhaps his survival could have purpose. In 1938, Wald was invited by the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics, then located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He briefly served as a research fellow there, continuing his work on economic theory. By September 1938, he had moved to Columbia University in New York as a Carnegie Corporation Fellow under Harold Hotelling. This was Wald's home for the rest of his career. He became an associate professor, then a full professor. He joined the faculty permanently. He was finally, after years of discrimination and displacement, where he belonged. Teaching, researching, creating new mathematics. When World War II began, America mobilized not just its factories and armies, but its minds. The Statistical Research Group was formally established at Columbia University, with charter members recognized on July 1, 1942. It would operate through 1945, tackling problems that could save lives. And one of the most urgent was the bomber problem. Allied bombers were being destroyed at an unsustainable rate. The military needed to know where to add armor. So, in December 1943, when the armor analysis proposal arrived at the SRG, it landed on Abraham Wald's desk. He looked at the diagrams, the silhouettes of B-17 seconds covered with dots representing damage. He looked at the statistical summaries, the bar charts showing damage by zone. He looked at the conclusions, add armor to fuselage, wings, and tail. And something bothered him. Something about the data felt wrong. Not incorrect, exactly, but incomplete, misleading, dangerous. He thought about it for days. He reviewed the methodology. He questioned the analysts about exactly how the data had been collected. He asked about sample selection, about which aircraft were being examined. And then he saw it, the fundamental flaw that everyone had missed. These diagrams showed only the planes that came back, only the survivors, only the lucky ones. What about the planes that did not come back? Where were they hit? What killed them? The engineers had been analysing a biased sample without realising it. They were only studying planes that survived combat and made it back to England. The planes that got shot down were not available for study. Those planes were scattered across Europe, crashed in German fields, burning in French forests, sunk in the English Channel, blown apart at altitude. Their damage patterns could not be documented. Their crews could not report what hit them. Their data was missing, gone, lost. And that missing data was the most important data of all. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Wald realized something profound about what the data was actually telling them. If the returning planes showed heavy damage to the fuselage, wings, and tail, that meant something very specific. It meant these areas could absorb significant damage, and the plane could still fly home. A bomber could take dozens of holes through the fuselage and keep flying. The crew might be terrified. There might be wounded men bleeding in the back, but the aircraft remained controllable. The engines kept running. The pilots could still fly it. Holes in the wings were serious, but not always fatal. The wings on a B-17 were massive structures with multiple spars and ribs providing redundancy. You could punch a lot of holes through them before the wing failed structurally. Metal skin could be torn. Fuel tanks could leak. But the underlying structure could absorb enormous punishment. Planes were surviving with hits to those areas. That was what the data was actually showing them. Not that these areas were vulnerable and needed protection, but that these areas could take damage without bringing the plane down. The tail showed heavy damage on returning aircraft. This made sense. German fighters often made stern attacks from behind, where only the tail gunner could return fire. But bombers with damaged tails were making it home. Control cables could be partially severed. Fabric could be torn. The vertical stabilizer could have holes punched through it, and the aircraft remained controllable enough to fly home. But the engines showed little damage on returning planes. Why? Not because engines were less likely to be hit. Wald assumed, on good evidence confirmed by combat analysis, that German fighters and flak aimed at the entire aircraft. Hits in combat were distributed fairly randomly across the bomber. There was no reason to think engines were magically protected or harder to hit. They were big, obvious targets. 4 radial engines, each nearly 4 feet in diameter, hanging off the wings in nacelles. Fighters specifically aimed for them, knowing that destroying an engine could bring down a bomber. Flak exploded near them. So why did returning planes show so little engine damage? The answer was chilling. The engines showed little damage on returning planes because planes hit in the engines did not return. They went down. A hit to an engine could start a fire that could not be extinguished. High-octane aviation fuel fed the flames. The magnesium components in the engine burned white-hot. The fire spread. The engine broke apart, pieces flying off, maybe damaging the wing or starting more fires. Or the hit destroyed the engine outright, stopping it instantly. 18 cylinders producing 1,200 horsepower reduced to dead weight in seconds. With one engine gone, a pilot could maybe limp home if they were close to England. The B-17 could fly on 3 engines if absolutely necessary. With 2 engines gone on the same wing, the plane became nearly uncontrollable. The asymmetric thrust made it want to roll over. It might dive into the ground before the pilot could regain control. The same logic applied to the cockpit. Few returning planes showed damage to the cockpit area, not because it was a small or protected target. The cockpit was right up front where fighters loved to make head-on attacks. The entire nose of the bomber was glazed with clear plexiglass panels. Fighters could see the pilots sitting there in their leather jackets and flight helmets. They aimed for them specifically, trying to kill the crew that controlled the aircraft. A Focke-Wulf, 190 making a head-on attack, would open fire with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, all aimed at the cockpit. So why did returning planes show limited cockpit damage? Because when the cockpit took a direct hit, when 20mm shells ripped through and killed the pilot and co-pilot, or wounded them so badly they could not fly, the plane did not come home. It crashed. The crew died. Maybe a few men in the back had time to bail out if they were lucky. Most did not. The fuel systems showed the same pattern. The fuel tanks held hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline in self-sealing tanks located in the wings. The self-sealing technology helped with small punctures, rubber layers that would swell and plug small holes. But it could not handle cannon fire. One tracer round, one incendiary shell, one piece of hot shrapnel hitting a fuel tank in just the wrong way could turn the entire bomber into a flying torch. Crews called it cooking off. The plane would light up, flames spreading instantly through fuel vapor. The crew had seconds to bail out if they were lucky. Most were not lucky. The fire consumed the oxygen. The flames blocked exits. Men burned alive or suffocated. So planes with severe fuel system damage did not make it back to England. They burned over Germany or limped partway and crashed in the Channel. Fishermen would sometimes find bodies floating in life jackets. Young men who had survived the crash only to die of exposure in the cold water while waiting for rescue that never came. The absence of engine damage on surviving planes was not evidence that engines were safe. It was evidence that engine damage was fatal. The absence of cockpit damage on surviving planes was not evidence that cockpits were well protected. It was evidence that cockpit damage killed the crew and doomed the plane. The absence of fuel system damage on surviving planes was not evidence that fuel tanks were secure. It was evidence that damaged fuel systems led to catastrophic fires and explosions. Wald had identified something profound, a systematic bias in how the data had been collected. The sample was not random. It was not representative. It was filtered by a selection process. That selection process was survival. Only planes that could survive their damage made it back to be studied. The planes that could not survive their damage were absent from the data, and their absence contained crucial information. Wald sat down to formalize his analysis. This was not just an insight. It was a mathematical problem that required rigorous statistical proof. He needed to work backward from biased data to infer what the complete unbiased data would look like. He needed to estimate the damage distribution for all aircraft, including the ones shot down, using only data from survivors. This required sophisticated statistical inference. He developed mathematical methods to account for selection bias. He created models of how damage affected survivability. He calculated what the missing data would look like if he could see it. His analysis showed that the engineer's conclusions were exactly backward. The data suggested that armor should not go on the parts with the most damage on returning planes. It should go on the parts with the least damage on returning planes, the engines, the cockpit, the fuel systems, the parts that, when hit, prevented planes from coming home at all. If a plane could survive hits to the fuselage and still fly home, the fuselage was not the critical vulnerability. The fabric of the fuselage could be patched, holes could be plugged, structural members could be reinforced in the field. But if planes hit in the engines never came home, then engines were the critical vulnerability. If planes hit in the cockpit never came home, then the cockpit needed protection. This was completely counterintuitive. It contradicted the obvious interpretation of the visible data. Every engineer looking at those diagrams had reached the same conclusion, and that conclusion was wrong. They were about to make a catastrophic mistake. They were about to armor exactly the wrong parts of the aircraft. They would have added 800 pounds of steel plating to areas that were already demonstrably survivable while leaving the truly vulnerable areas unprotected. Bombers would have been heavier, less maneuverable, able to carry fewer bombs and less fuel, and they would have been no safer than before. More crews would have died, all because no one had thought to ask about the missing data. Wald presented his analysis to the SRG. The implications were immediately clear to the other statisticians. Milton Friedman later called it one of the most elegant pieces of applied statistics he had ever seen. Harold Hotelling recognized that Wald had identified a principle that extended far beyond bomber armor. The SRG operated under a specific policy that shaped how Wald presented his findings to the military. They were analysts, not commanders. Their job was to analyze data and answer the questions they were asked. They did not make explicit military recommendations about implementation. That was for military command to decide based on the analysis. So Wald wrote his conclusions carefully. He presented the statistical reasoning. He showed what the data implied. He explained the selection bias. He calculated what the missing data suggested, but he stopped short of saying, "You must armor the engines and cockpit." That decision belonged to the officers who understood aircraft design, production constraints, and operational requirements. The military officers who received Wald's analysis understood immediately. This was not abstract mathematics. This was life and death. They had been about to implement a solution that would have wasted resources and saved no lives. Wald had shown them why their intuition was wrong and what the data actually meant. The decision was made. Armor would be added to engines, cockpit, and fuel systems. Additional cowling around the engines to protect against flak and small arms fire. Armor plating behind the pilot's seats. Reinforced fuel tank protection beyond the self-sealing rubber layers. The weight penalty was similar to the original proposal, but the armor was in completely different locations. Production began in early 1944. Armour kits were manufactured and shipped to England. Ground crews installed them on bombers between missions. By spring of 1944, most B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds in the 8th Air Force had the additional protection based on Wald's analysis. The results were measurable. Loss rates began to decline. Not dramatically, not overnight. The war was still brutal. Bombers were still being shot down. But statistical analysis comparing similar missions before and after the armour modification showed improvement. Fewer planes were lost to engine fires. Fewer pilots were killed by cockpit hits. Fewer catastrophic fuel explosions. The exact number of lives saved is impossible to calculate precisely. Too many variables. Too many factors affecting bomber losses. Weather, fighter opposition, flak concentrations, target selection, crew experience, all these influenced survival rates. But post-war analysis suggested that Wald's armour placement recommendations reduced bomber losses by approximately 10 to 15% compared to what would have occurred with the original fuselage and wing armour. Proposal: 10 to 15% across hundreds of thousands of bomber sorties from spring 1944 through May 1945 translates to approximately 4,000 bombers that returned home instead of being shot. Down: 4,000 aircraft, 40,000 airmen, men who completed missions they might not have otherwise survived, men who went home to families, who raised children, who built careers, who lived full lives, all because one mathematician asked a simple question: where are the planes that did not return? Wald wrote 8 technical memoranda for the SRG analysing damage distribution on aircraft. These were not simple documents written for general audiences. They were severely technical, filled with equations and statistical proofs that only specialists could fully understand. Pages of mathematical notation, probability distributions, conditional probabilities, maximum likelihood estimation. He developed methods to estimate the true distribution of damage across all aircraft, both survivors and casualties, using only the biased sample of survivors. This required working backward through layers of statistical inference. If we see this pattern in the survivors, and we know that survival depends on where damage occurs, then we can infer what pattern must have existed in the complete population, including non-survivors. The mathematics was elegant, the logic was ironclad, and the implications extended far beyond bomber armour. Wald had identified one of the most important concepts in statistics and critical thinking, a concept that would later be called survivorship bias. The systematic error that occurs when you study only successes, only survivors, only winners, and forget that the failures have information too. Perhaps the most important information. His papers were classified during the war for security reasons. The enemy could not know how American operational research was improving bomber survivability. The documents remained classified for decades after the war ended, gathering dust in military archives. They were finally declassified in the late 1970s, as part of a broader review of World War II technical documents. In 1980, the Center for Naval Analyses published Wald's complete wartime memoranda in a volume titled A Method of Estimating Plane Vulnerability Based on Damage of Survivors. Researchers could finally examine the original work in detail. Statisticians studied his methods. Military analysts incorporated his techniques into modern operational research. Historians recognized the significance of what he had accomplished. The military used Wald's statistical methods throughout the rest of World War II. His approach to analyzing battle damage became standard procedure across all services. The principle he established became embedded in military operational research for decades to come. Question your sample selection. Think about the missing data. Consider what you cannot see. Ask why certain data is available and other data is not. His work was used in the Korean War when new aircraft needed armor assessment. Jets were replacing propeller-driven bombers, but the fundamental question remained the same. Where should limited armor be placed for maximum protection? Analysts applied Wald's methods, examining battle damage on returning aircraft and inferring what the missing data from lost aircraft would show. It was used in the Vietnam War when helicopter survivability became critical. Helicopters faced different threats than bombers: small arms fire from the ground, rocket-propelled grenades, surface-to-air missiles. But the statistical principle remained identical. Study what comes back, but think hard about what does not come back and why. The methods were taught at military academies and war colleges. Officers learned to think like Wald, to see not just the data in front of them, but the invisible data hidden by survivorship, to recognize that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that what you cannot see may be more important than what you can see. But Wald's contribution went far beyond military applications. He had identified a cognitive trap that affects human reasoning across every domain, a systematic bias in how we collect and interpret evidence. And once you understand survivorship bias, once you truly see it, you start recognizing it everywhere. In business, we study successful companies and read case studies about winning strategies. Harvard Business School builds its entire curriculum around case studies of successful companies. Students analyze what Apple did right, what Amazon's brilliant strategy was, what made Google dominate search. But we rarely examine the thousands of companies that tried identical strategies and failed. For every Apple, there were dozens of computer companies that pursued elegant design and vertical integration and went bankrupt. For every Amazon, there were hundreds of online retailers that lost money on every sale, hoping to make it up in volume, and collapsed. For every Google, there were scores of search engines with similar algorithms that users simply never adopted. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.